Hello Year 12 and welcome to today's lesson. Today you're going to be doing a source question. So take a look at the question here, and the first thing I'd like you to do is to highlight the keywords. What is it that we're looking for in our sources? Hopefully you managed to highlight the fact that we are looking for the nature of the relationship between the Provisional Government and the Petrograd Soviet in the period February to April 1917. So what can these sources tell us about the relationship between the Provisional Government and the Petrograd Soviet? It's also a how far question. So it's a judgment on how useful the two sources are. Of course they're going to be useful in some way, otherwise we would have not been given them by the examiner. So we just have to make a judgment. Are they extremely useful or are they somewhat useful? Take a look at both sources now. So firstly we have source 1, a telegram from War Minister Guchkov to General Alexeev, Commander-in-Chief of the Russian Army. Now read through and look for anything that tells you about the relationship between the two. Grab your highlighter. What are they saying about the power of each? Well, this one, I've picked out a range of different things. So in red there is everything I would have highlighted. I think that first particular sentence is really interesting. The Provisional Government has no power of any kind. Its orders are carried out only to the extent that is permitted by the Soviet. So clearly this is a source that suggests this idea of dual power is not correct, that it's the Petrograd Soviet who hold the most power. It's the idea of them being the watchdog. Now what I find particularly interesting in this source is the fact that it's clearly saying the Provisional Government has no power, and yet it is written by the War Minister of the Provisional Government. It's written by Guchkov, who hopefully you remember is an Octoberist. He was forced to leave following the Menshevik crisis. He was a strong supporter of the government. Remember, the Octoberists are the more right wing of the Liberals. So isn't that interesting? It's by the Provisional Government, and yet it is highlighting the weaknesses of the Provisional Government. That makes me feel more like I'm going to trust this source, because one would expect it to be bigging up the Provisional Government, but it clearly isn't. I also probably respect the source because Guchkov is a war minister, therefore he'd be informed and probably a more reliable source. If I look at why the source was written, well, it's a telegram to another official. Therefore, it's not publicised, it's not written as like propaganda to sway anyone's opinion. It is likely to be his truthful understanding or interpretation of the events, which makes it even more interesting that he says they've got no power at all. It's right after the February Revolution, so it's 9th of March 1917. Remember, the Russian calendar means that we say February, but to the rest of the world it was March. This means that he is trying to inform a commander-in-chief who is not at home, not in Petrograd, of domestic events. And therefore he's going to be as accurate as possible. Let's take a look at the other source now. So source 2. What does this tell us about the relationship between the two? Who holds more power? Is it the Petrograd Soviet or is it the Provisional Government? Well, I think this agrees with the first source. It is simply saying that it's the Petrograd Soviet that is holding more power, not the Provisional Government. Things I've picked out is that it says we will support it for so long as it realises democratic principles. Doesn't that feel a bit threatening? It's the idea of we'll only support you if you listen to what we say. We shall support all of its measures which tend towards the common good, but all else we shall unmask. It's quite threatening, isn't it? So clearly it's the Petrograd Soviet saying, we'll only do what we want to do, really. So if we look at its provenance, this source comes from the Menshevik Chairman of the Petrograd Soviet. Now, that would mean he's going to be well informed of the views and opinions of the Petrograd Soviet. Look at the reason he is writing. He is addressing a delegation of students who came to the Soviet with a banner hailing the Provisional Government. So he is reacting to supporters of the Provisional Government. It is a public speech, in contrast to the other one. He's likely to be trying to stress the power of the Petrograd Soviet, therefore. Could he be exaggerating this to win support? Well, I'm not really that sure he is. Because we know that the Petrograd Soviet did have more power. I think it's more a statement of fact. And as I've already mentioned, he is well informed, providing us a good insight into the Petrograd Soviet's opinion. What I like here is if we use these two sources together, we get the opinion of the Provisional Government and the opinion of the Petrograd Soviet from two insiders, people who would know about the opinions of each. And yet they both agree. We'd expect them to say totally different things, and yet they agree. Now, because it gives us an insight from both sides, I would call this a comprehensive pair of sources. And we're always looking for a pair of sources that are more comprehensive because they'll be more useful. If it shows us two very different opinions, left and right, peasant and rich, urban and rural, that is better. It is more comprehensive than simply looking at one side. So I think these pair of sources, it's a good pair to look at together because contrasting provenance, and yet they say the same thing. So in terms of structuring, I would always recommend to start off with your inferences. What does this suggest about the relationship between the Petrograd Soviet and the Provisional Government? Now, I think a source essay like this is always strongest if we don't break the two sources apart. Instead, find three inferences that can be supported by both sources. Or maybe two that can be supported by both sources and one that's just one source, that's fine. But have the inference drive the paragraph. So start off with the inference. One thing the sources suggest is that the Provisional Government had very little power. Back it up with source evidence, quotes from both, and then back it up with your own knowledge. But ensure you are driven by the sources at all times. Don't start with your own knowledge. Once you've looked at the inferences and drawn out everything you can about what the sources suggest about this relationship, have a look at the provenance of each. Now this time I think it is okay to break it down into a paragraph on the provenance of source 1, its strengths and its weaknesses, and then the provenance of source 2, its strengths and its weaknesses. I would, however, introduce a sort of mini conclusion at the end of provenance 2 to bring together this idea that, well, it's useful to look at these two provenances as a pair. It's useful because they come from two different sides, and therefore we are given a more comprehensive view. And lastly, return to that conclusion. Make your judgment clear. Overall, how useful are they? They're obviously pretty useful. You're not going to say they're not useful. I would suggest these are two very useful sources. What do they suggest? Right, this essay is going to be due next Wednesday. Miss Simpkins will be taking the lesson. She will be taking in your essay books and marking the essay. Your essay books are under the whiteboard, so please go and pick them up. On top of them is the sources. So, next Wednesday, this can be done at home or it can be done right now, whatever you fancy. Thank you.